Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us for this latest iteration of the Chamber's Industrial Revolution 4.0 webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about geoeconomics and technology, which is certainly a topic we've been hearing a lot about in the news recently. My name is Mark Agnew. I'm the Vice President, Policy and International at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and thank you again for taking the time this afternoon to join us. For those of you who've listened into the previous iterations of our Fourth Industrial Revolution webinar series, you'll know that these are meant to provide a chance to both inform members as to what's going on in particular sort of areas of the tech space, as well as providing a dialogue with government. And we're very glad to have representation from the Government of Canada on this panel. And certainly this topic has become, I think, quite salient in the face of a lot of companies facing foreign interference and espionage threats, which I know was a topic that we had CSIS come in and talk to us about last year. So I see this webinar very much as being a continuation of that earlier discussion, and we're glad to have four distinguished guests with us. So before we get into the conversation, I'm actually going to ask each of our guests just to say a brief word of introduction about themselves and the organization, and then we'll get into the conversation. So how about Ray? Why don't we start with you?
Hey, good afternoon, folks. Bonjour tout le monde. Pleasure to be here. My name is Ray Boivere. I'm a security associate partner at IBM Canada. I'm responsible for all the public sector areas across the country. I've also worked in other parts of IBM in the last 2 years that I've been there, including industrial, commercial, and all areas of the private sector across the country. My background, however, is national security and both nationally mostly. I left the Canadian Security Intelligence Service in 2012 as the Assistant Director responsible for intelligence. And after 5 years of private practice, I also had an opportunity to work in Ontario. I was an Associate Deputy Minister and also the Security Advisor for the province, which provided me an opportunity to work more closely with cities and provincial jurisdictions. And so thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. Dominic, over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everybody. Bonjour. My name is Dominic LeBlanc. I am a Senior Assistant Deputy Minister here at the Department of Public Safety Canada with the federal government, and I'm responsible for the National and Cyber Security Branch. I've been with government now for almost 20 years, primarily in the national security space. I've had stints at the Communications Security Establishment, at the Privy Council Office, at the Treasury Board Secretariat, and I've been here at Public Safety for the last 18 months. My responsibilities here primarily cover national security policy, national security operations, but it also includes cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, and economic security. And I'm equally delighted to be here with all of you.
Thanks, Dominic. Matthew, want to go over to you next?
Yeah, sure. Also happy to be here. So my name is Matthew Costello. I've been in the data protection industry for 20 years. I currently work at Dell Technologies, leading their data protection solutions division. And I've had the luxury of working with customers from the largest of the banks all the way down to the smallest of companies. I'm trying to help architect sort of their journey through cloud, as well as on-prem, off-prem, all the latest waves that we're seeing these days. So really excited to be here to talk about this subject. Thank you.
And last but not least, Tim.
Great, just want to double check you can hear me.
You're coming through clear, Tim.
Perfect, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting Amazon Web Services to participate in this event. My name is Tim Rains. I'm a regional leader for security and compliance with AWS. Focusing on the Americas. So I spent a lot of time with my Canadian peers, helping federal government, provincial government, and so on. Prior to this, I spent 17 or 18 years at Microsoft as their chief security advisor and a number of other roles. And then over this past year, I just want to point out that I actually published a book on cybersecurity. It took a long time. This is my pandemic baby. Took me a long time to write this. If you're interested, it's on Amazon.com. But really focused on threat intelligence and mitigating advanced threats.
Okay, that's right. Thanks a lot, Tim. Some of us have picked up baking, and others have written books. So glad to see there's a sort of diverse set of background being brought to the discussion. And this is also just a reminder for the folks that are still dialing on that if you do want to submit a question, which we definitely encourage you to do so, you can go over to Slido, and it's hashtag H as in hotel 855 for the event. And so we'll get to those questions a little later on in the conversation. So how about maybe just to start the conversation, maybe I'll go to Dominic first. And, you know, what we've seen a lot in the news recently, and maybe not so recently, but, you know, longstanding, you know, the state actors using technology for geopolitical purposes, which is, I think, sort of the definition that most people use for geoeconomics. Given your background in government over the 20-year career that you've had, I'd just be curious to hear a little bit about what are some of the trends that you're seeing and some of the emerging risks from the federal government's perspective as it pertains to economic espionage and foreign interference for Canadian businesses.
Thanks, Mark. I've jotted down a few ideas that I think I'll go through them very quickly, only to give you a bit of a perspective from a federal government point of view, and then happy to pass things on and get the conversation going. I think it goes without saying that the development of new technologies has become an important domain of interstate competition, and many now play a key role on determinants of military power and economic prosperity. In response to that, potential adversaries have developed aggressive strategies to acquire Canadian scientific and technological expertise held in academia, in government, and in the private sector using both legal and illegal means. So from a government perspective, we have to question whether or not Canada's existing programs and policy tools designed to respond to these national security threats, because they're not new, are they still fit to purpose? There is also now added urgency to identify and address vulnerabilities in our critical supply chains, many of which depend on hostile foreign states. All of Canada's Five Eyes partners, so New Zealand, Australia, the UK, the United States, are all taking action to upgrade their capabilities to better protect their sensitive technologies and intellectual property, their sensitive personal data, and their critical infrastructure from the predatory actions of hostile foreign actors. And I think that we're going to have to contemplate, obviously, doing the same. Foreign threat actors pursue traditional and non-traditional intelligence collection strategies to acquire scientific knowledge and technology here in Canada. In addition to cyber theft and traditional espionage, state and non-state threat actors use, from our perspective, 4 economic-based strategies to acquire this technology. They look to take advantage of foreign investment. They look to take advantage of importing goods and technology directly from Canada. They look to research partnerships with Canadian researchers and universities. And finally, they also look to secure licenses to operate in regulated sectors of the economy. So in recent times, we've also seen an increased reliance on sophisticated cyber tools by foreign states to steal sensitive information, conduct ransomware attacks, and cause disruption. As a quick illustration, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen the health sector in particular targeted by foreign states attempting to steal research and intellectual property related to vaccines, to testing, and other aspects of our response efforts for their own benefit. And furthermore, foreign states have leveraged the pandemic to spread disinformation online to discredit public health efforts and cause confusion about government policies and decisions. So bottom line, I believe that industry, academia, and government must work closely together to identify and address all of these threats, as well as the risks associated with technology caused by these foreign state actors. I'll leave it at there.
Okay, thanks, Dominic. And I think in the Q&A, there's certainly probably going to be a couple of things to unpack there, and I look forward to that part of the conversation. So I'll shift over to Ray now. And Ray, I mean, we were sort of, joking before the webinar went live that you've had the advantage of seeing from, both the government and the private sector perspective, how the machinery all works. And also in the case of your experience federally and provincially as well. So I'd just be curious, to drawing on some of that corporate memory, what have you seen in terms of how the threat environment has evolved over the last number of years?
Yeah, Mark, great question. And I think the easiest way to look back on it, think about it, is in about 38 years of practice, I've definitely benefited from having a front row seat and seeing how, in many ways, the security environment changed. It transformed, it morphed, it returned. And that's probably one of the first reflections that I'll say is history and the forces that drive threats and risks are rather circular. And a lot of them they have very similar cycles and variations, more or less, on a lot of very familiar themes. And I'll give you a quick stream of consciousness to sort of underline, where I'm going with that. And so you think back at 1984, creation of CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. I joined as a young officer, and it's right in the heart of the Cold War. I'm working on the Soviet desk. And at that time, thinking back about the nature of the threats we were investigating and developing sources on and providing analysis for government for decision making, it was very much around geostrategic threats. And that meant, of course, the theft of intellectual property was part of that format. Now, albeit it was mostly around government plans and military operations and so on. But it was also, interestingly enough, a lot about foreign influence operations, disinformation campaigns, just generally speaking, the distortion of the truth. And that, to me, I refer to that quite often as that first phase of my practical career in intelligence work. Then if you shift into the next phase, which got us at the close of the Cold War into the early 90s, into the end of that decade, we're looking at very much a different sort of set of evolving issues. There was a lot around violence, politically, religiously motivated violence, homeland issues, radicalization issues. And of course, that led to a number of things, including what is seen as the longest conflict in the Western world involving Afghanistan and Iraq. So then, of course, all of those intelligence assets were moved towards the counterterrorism programs. And then suddenly, and probably suddenly, I should say more gradually, and it started occurring in my last position at CSIS as the assistant director, and I was briefing ministers in Ottawa around some of the threats. Within that briefing set of packages I had, the word cyber started to emerge more and more. And around looking around at that time, it was really around state actors looking to steal Canadian intellectual property, looking still to steal Canadian government assets and information and so on. So it still had a lot of the same things around an intellectual property. There's certainly around this next phase two, this phase three, there was radicalization, as we've seen through, again, the perversion of ideas and the hijacking of a lot of issues, and all based on the idea that you can bring about a lot of impacts using information pathways of the internet. And so the difference, of course, now is a lot more right-wing violence and the things that have emerged from that. So now you fast forward to what we're seeing today. And in a lot of ways, it looks a lot like the 1980s in the sense that we've brought back a lot of geostrategic risks. The Cold War has actually has reemerged in some formats and some in academia would refer to. Certainly a massive threat of intellectual property. Some have argued it's been the single most important loss of intellectual property in the history of humanity. But, and now, of course, it's been focused on privately held R&D, everything from the research, of course, that was just mentioned a moment ago by Dominic and other parts. But it's also around subversion of democracies. And there's a lot of subtle stuff going on through the same pathways. So sort of closing up on my thoughts, I'd say, well, the big striking issue around that I've seen is a convergence of interests. And by extension, I mean there's exponential growth of threat actors, threat actor types, their capabilities. A convergence, what I mean by interest is a convergence of nation states using proxies, using criminal organized groups to achieve their objectives. And quite often criminal organized groups also benefiting from the best technology from some of these kleptocracies and totalitarian states that see them doing their bidding and they get to share in some of the profits and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting set of trend lines that I've observed for sure. And that the biggest lesson learned, though, I'd say, is that Canadian businesses can no longer hide, right? There is no more local business. We all have a point of presence somewhere in the ether of the internet. We all do business in many areas across the country. One of us leads to the pathway to a compromise of another. And this sort of small village of business, and that's what it really has become, can be touched by anybody halfway around the world or in the city next door. And that can be done through ransomwares. It can be done through denial or digital denials of service attacks or DDoS. And also, finally, it's all these different layers that we never used to think were in the target zones. And those include municipalities, provincial governments, and other areas of responsibility. And they're all targeted for the same reasons. It's the same mode as it was during the 1920s around bank robberies. It's where the money is. And today that means typically is where the data resides. And that's why everybody has to start looking at this in very geostrategic ways. But also, and I'll go back to Dominic's comments, that it really starts off with awareness, situational awareness and understanding what we're up against, and then investing effectively and coming together with the right kind of measures and the right kind of expertise and help. And that may involve some assistance outside your organization. But I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ray. Well, I think that actually sort of tees up to draw Tim to the conversation now, because a lot of the clients and folks that you worked with, Ray, over the years, they're using AWS products to have their data up in the cloud. And so Tim, I think about AWS. I mean, the company brand that you develop relies ultimately on protecting the data, whether it's IP, customer data or whatnot that a company holds. And so from a cloud computing perspective, could you maybe say a little bit about sort of how security works in the cloud and what's the approach of AWS to make investments to stay ahead of the threat curve?
Sure. Yeah. I totally agree with what Ray said. In some ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So there's been this proliferation of threat actors, but at the same time, they're using the same 5 ways they've always used to initially compromise enterprise IT environments. And so, those tactics haven't changed. And so, focusing on the fundamentals is key here. So what we've been doing as an industry for the last 25 or 30 years hasn't been working. I mean, that's pretty clear. And you can hear from, the world that Ray described and how the threat landscape has evolved. That's pretty clear. And so I think what the cloud represents is a change, an actual change in the way that organizations can protect their data. And so the way that AWS has approached this is we could spend the whole hour talking about how the cloud protects data. But as an introduction to this, there's 2 things that's different about the cloud. Number one is everything is API driven, application program interface driven. So there's only 3 ways you can interact with the cloud. You open up your browser, log into your administrative console in AWS, and now you can interact with over 200 services. You can use the command line interface so that you can run manual commands or write scripts that then interact with the cloud. And then finally, you can use a software development kit and write an application that interacts with the cloud. In all 3 of those cases, they're using APIs to interact with the cloud that the cloud exposes to them. So from a security perspective and a compliance perspective, if you just log everything that happens in those API calls, who's making the call, where they're logging from, what call was it, what was the result of the call, and so on, all those details, then security is simplified because now you can just look at what everybody is doing inside of your own account. So your security team has visibility that could never, ever get on premise. And so now, since everything's an API call, you can do some interesting automation with that. And so you can use automation to watch what's happening in your account and then take action when you see indicators of compromise or when things fall out of compliance to a standard. You can take action to bring it back into compliance automatically or quarantine it or do whatever you want because everything is code. We talk about, infrastructure as code. It's not just the data, but all of the infrastructure used to process your data, you can actually automate all of that as well. And so those are 2 big game changers when it comes to computing is this ability to use APIs and automate everything. And so in terms of innovation, AWS has been leading the way with artificial intelligence and machine learning, not as buzzwords, but to actually do real work. So for instance, all that logging, if you've got a big organization and they're doing a lot of things in the cloud, it can be massive log files with all of the interactions. And so there's no way for humans sitting in a security operations center doing queries, looking for threats to keep up with a volume like that. You need machines to help you. And so that's what we use artificial intelligence and machine learning for is we offer services that use AI and ML to process massive amounts of the log details inside of your account, looking for indicators of compromise, looking for things falling out of compliance, and then allowing you to automate the response. When that happens, you're monitoring in near real time. You're actually able to react in near real time, shrinking the possibility of that time frame between compromise and detection of compromise isn't months or years like we've seen in these on-premises environments, but literally down into seconds and minutes, which if you can reduce that, then you can reduce the damage, you can reduce the cost associated with the damage and so on. So the cloud really is a game changer when it comes to security and compliance.
All right, that's great. And I'm guessing, Tim, just based on when you talk about AI and machine learning, you are probably fed up with Skynet jokes being made about AWS technology, I'm guessing.
Well, I'm sure I haven't heard them all, but
you've heard a few in your time.
Yes, it's interesting. Like, there's a hype scale for everything, but I can really say that going through massive amounts of data in near real time has always been impossible for humans to do. It doesn't matter how many people you have doing it, right? And so imagine if you have the ability to scale AI and ML capabilities to an previously unbelievable scale to churn through massive amounts of data in near real time. It's just an absolute game changer.
Yep. And so, Matt, this is where I want to, I guess, bring you into the conversation, because in your role at Dell, I mean, you approach us from a different perspective, because you're the one who's brought in for the recovery phase after a critical incident has occurred. And so, we talked about the threats and the prevention piece, but from your perspective, how have you seen changes in your clients when it comes to the recovery and protection tools that they're using to, again, sort of adapt to the intentions of malicious actors?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, from my angle, the bad actors are getting in, right? We're seeing it every day in the newspaper, across Canada, across the globe. I think, you hear stats like every 39 seconds, there's a successful cyber attack. And, whether the bad actors intending on stealing data, right, IP, et cetera, or whether they're looking to paralyze the customer for a ransom attack. I mean, what we've seen with backup and recovery is that the bad actors are actually going out and intentionally trying to take, critical rebuild material out in an environment so that, customers have to pay the ransomware. And if you think about it, one of the things that's changed, I mean, organizations across, the globe have always built disaster recovery scenarios, right? And disaster recovery is quite a bit different than cyber recovery. So in a DR scenario where you would have a customer that's, replicating applications between sites in the event where there's, a hurricane or an earthquake, all of those environments are on the network, right? And so they become available for breach, or vulnerabilities. And so there's a lot changing in data protection, and it has to do with there's a lot more pressure on recovery from traditional tools to recover from cyber events. So it's really about ensuring that cyber resilience includes cyber recovery. So if you think of the NIST framework, recovery is a portion of that. And really what Dell's recommending now is 3 I's. So we talk about isolated copies, right? So, the creation of a vault that's automated so that we can take information, third copy off-site or off network in an automated process, right? So Tim brought up the use of APIs and things to that effect. It's got to be automated. We need to be immutable when it's inside the vault so that someone can't get access to it and destroy it. So in the form of, retention lock capabilities where I could, put a lock on the data for 30 days. And then lastly, we need it to be intelligent. So we need to be able to drive AI capabilities, analytics, so that we can go through the backup data and ensure that there aren't anomalies, So we've seen customers where, maybe they're backing up 100 terabytes a day, and then all of a sudden, they're hit with a ransom attack, and they look back in their records, and they have basically seen their production environments only back up 5 terabytes a day. So a lot of the data in production was eliminated. So we're looking for anomalies like that. We're looking for executable files in backup. We're looking for whether or not we have the ability to go back and restore the data to a point in time, right? So those are the 3 things that we're really looking to do. And just a significant amount more pressure on backup tools, for sure.
Great. So I guess just pivoting a bit more to the government industry dialogue that goes on. Dominic, could you say a little bit about how Public Safety Canada approaches its communications how Public Safety Canada approaches its communications outreach with industry to communicate risks in a proactive manner?
It sounds like a really simple question, but in fact, reaching out on these issues is a very complex one. And I've seen Ray smile because he probably lived through this during his long time at CSIS. Frankly, right from the outset, let me say that within Public Safety Canada, we are working on a comprehensive policy framework for economic-based threats to national security. That's a bit of a mouthful, but suffice to say that we are leading 16, 17 departments together, trying to pull together a comprehensive policy framework to touch on the tools that I said have been in place but need to be modernized. And that means that instead of doing things in silos, and when you open up a newspaper today, you'll read about threats, you know, whether they're coming through procurement, that, you know, the government of Canada has procurements with different companies, and that might cause us pause for concern. You might be reading about universities and, you know, research grants and partnerships in those spaces. So we do have some rules, but the federal government doesn't come together and make sure that we're communicating in one voice across all of these various different sectors. We're, you know, listening to Tim and Matthew talk about the significant issue of cyber security. Think about cybersecurity in the finance world. Think about cybersecurity in the transport world or the critical infrastructure world. These are key areas where if we don't have, you know, the best and the brightest coming up with ways to protect these critical areas of society, there are some significant issues that could take place there. The challenge, of course, is that not everyone is created equal, and the federal government has to come up with a way of providing advice and guidance. Yes, increase awareness as a first step, but then what? If I go out and I say to a company or to a university, there are some really bad people looking to do some really bad things, but I can't share classified information with you. I just need to increase your awareness, but I can't help you with anything. That becomes a significant issue. So we have to be better at collaborating and being able to offer something. That's not to say that we haven't been doing anything. We did introduce a cybersecurity strategy. That cybersecurity strategy has a grants and contributions program, a call out for partnerships that have led to, laying the foundation for a quantum safe Canada. We have a quantum key distribution protocol authentication project that is up and running. So there are certain things that are happening in the cybersecurity space, I think, that are very positive. We run out of public safety a safeguarding science initiative where we do outreach to universities. The Department of Innovation, Science, Innovation, Science and Industry has a program with the top 15 universities, for example. So there's lots of dialogue that's happening. We have great collaboration with telecommunications companies, for example. And we have federal departments like the Communications Security Establishment and the newly established Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. They're providing now a service, and there's lots of outreach happening in that space. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police have a new center. We also have to remember as well, it's not just discovering some of these intrusions and cleaning it up, but I think most Canadians would expect us then to go after the perpetrators. And what are we doing about the perpetrators, and are we able to prosecute them? So there's a whole challenge with regard to how do we actually get law enforcement up to speed and give them the tools to be able to go after the perpetrators and cause some disincentive there. So needless to say, it's now a significant time to approach this from a team aspect. And the federal government needs to get all of the different departments and agencies responsible in play. There are provinces and municipalities that have to step up as well. And then we need to make sure that all of the various dialogues and tables that we have established, we need to make them even more profitable and even more productive when it comes to trying to deal with this problem going forward.
No, well, thanks a lot for that. And I can see there was a question that was submitted on Slido about national security strategy. I think we'll maybe have a chance to come back to that in the audience Q&A portion a bit more. So, Ray, I'm not going to ask you to sort of critique Dominic, but I'll ask you to critique the government of Canada as a whole. And just say, again, because you've seen it from both sides of the ledger, and if there's something that you could advise your former government colleagues on to improve and enhance industry outreach, what would that be?
I'll start off with a simple figure. We just completed a survey. Our IBM Institute of Business Value asked a good number of CEOs across the country and said, what are your top priorities? And 46% of them said cybersecurity will be one of the most important or top priorities in technology for at least a foreseeable future. So despite what I said earlier as well about the cyclical nature of threats and risks, we're no doubt in really uncharted territory here. And this is possibly due to the speed and complexity of the challenges and some of the stuff that Dominic's alluding to. But I do underline the fact these bang on a particular set of rules that key institutions have to play. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, or also known as the CCCS, has a big role to play. It already has quite a bit of prominence from being that interface. I think I do agree as well. There are expectations from the public that we're going to do more than just identify and report. We're going to see how do we get a little more strategic? Are there global norms? Are there treaties at the diplomatic level? Are there opportunities for a form of a cyber imposition of will? In other words, you can either punish some of the perpetrators through shutting down and hacking back, as it's been called. Of course, we recognize even our military leaders have said that's extremely consequential and it can be very, very dangerous in terms of having unexpected consequences from that. But generally speaking, the one point I would seize on in terms of Dominic's comments is that the time is right. We do have a need for better public-private partnerships because the public sector can't do it alone. They cannot spend what, for example, what IBM spends, about $5 billion a year each year in R&D, makes us one of the top investors in Canada in that. You cannot develop the sort of things in the timeline that the private sector does, including all of us on this panel. So I think that's where some of the big impacts would be. And we have to also recognize that at the end of the day, too, that organizations themselves, like companies, large, medium, and small, have a role to play. And that means, in my view, they have to think about their own risk management. Do they embed that across the enterprise? Do they take advantage of cloud? I mean, IBM's now transformed itself again in its 110-year history. We're now a cloud, cognitive, and security company. And that, I think, represents the pillars of what most of the advances in technology, including, of course, blockchain and quantum, which we also spend a lot in development on. So the idea is that technology will be, as we've seen through the pandemic, the solution to our challenges. Technology will be the purveyors of numerous opportunities, but it'll equally be the purveyor of threats. And through that, security then needs some of the stuff that Tim was talking about. We have fully automated and orchestrated almost all of our security solutions that are almost in the 12 top segments in the world. And as a result, we do believe that this is going to take a lot of investment. It's going to take a lot of thinking and a lot of partnerships, and mostly a spirit of innovation, breaking down the old barriers that used to divide government and business to government, and even within the business sectors, trying to soften that competitive edge. If we all hang alone, we will all lose. If we can find ways to share threat intelligence and work together, we'll all be a lot stronger.
Well, and I think picking up on that point about sharing information, and this is where I want to sort of pivot a little bit in terms of the type of government industry dialogue that we're talking about, and to go to Tim, because I know one of the things that is a concern sometimes for companies is government access to the data that's held by cloud providers such as AWS. And so I'd just be curious to know, not necessarily just in Canada, but from a global perspective, how does AWS interact with governments when it comes to those requests for access to data that is held on your servers?
Sure. So I spent almost 3 years as the AWS regional lead for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I was based in London. And so I've had these conversations a lot with folks, particularly in Western Europe, where they have more stringent standards around privacy than, say, within the United States or other countries. And when I moved back to North America, I was really surprised to see that the same types of questions in Canada as well. So, I talk to customers about government access to data a lot. So it's important to understand that for AWS, security is our top priority, and we're extremely vigilant about protecting our customers' data. It doesn't matter, who unauthorized access is from, whether it's a government or an adversary or whomever. We have our customers back. There's no question about that. And so when it comes to government access to data using lawful methods like a warrant or a subpoena or other type of court order, that's where we help our customers multiple ways. One is we make sure that if we receive an order, that it's a binding order, it's a valid order, that it's not overreaching, that everything is in order, it meets the letter of the law. within Canada or whatever country we're doing business in. Second, we're never going to give up data from our customers unless we receive a binding and authoritative order from a court somewhere. Third, we provide our customers with encryption technology, and let's face it, encryption is the ultimate data protection technology, and multiple ways to manage those keys and that they use for encryption. And so if they want to encrypt their data and keep the keys on premise and put that data in the cloud, they can do so knowing full well that no one's going to access that data without those keys. And so, our preference is to always tell our customers and redirect law enforcement to the customer if they're requesting data from that customer. And encrypting data and keeping the keys on-prem is a great way to, great mechanism to make sure that that's the only way that law enforcement or a government's request somewhere is going to result in content. And then finally, I'll say that we try to be transparent about these things. We actually publish an information request report twice a year that dictates or publishes the volume of warrants and subpoenas and those types of orders so that our customers can see what's happening. And so, the last one that just published here recently, we actually published that, data content requests for content from the United States for data held outside of the United States, didn't result in any data, any content being provided to law enforcement at all. And so, we publish those reports to provide transparency so that customers can look at, there's two sides of the risk equation, the probability side and the impact side. They already know what the impact side is. And so what we're trying to do is provide transparency on the probability side of that equation so they can see that just, how remote cloud service providers providing data to law enforcement actually is.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Tim. And so I'm going to go to Matthew in a second, but just a quick reminder for folks that we do have the opportunity to submit audience questions. So it's hashtag H as in hotel 855 on Slido. I see there's a couple of questions that have been submitted, and we have another one that's come into the Zoom chat box. So we'll start to get to those in just a moment. But before we do, so Matt, I guess from your perspective, again, because you're at the sort of, the very end of the chain here when there's been a critical incident, something has gone wrong. And I guess from your perspective, what is it that government needs to do to better help companies prepare for that recovery, phase, to be able to, work with companies, like Dell, to make sure that, they're able to have their data, back to them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we've seen great examples where industries are working together to build best practices, right? I think of the Sheltered Harbor Consortium in the US, where large financial institutions, built some standards to protect customers and the financial institution, as well as public confidence in the event where there's catastrophic failure. And in that scenario, they recommend a vault capability, right? The isolation of data sets in order to ensure that there is a recovery point. And Dell is the only vendor on that list as far as the vault piece, right? So they've set some best practices, some standards, and I think, Dominic talked about not everyone is created equal, and part of that is the resources that the large financial institutions have versus the smaller organizations out there aren't the same, right? And so I think when I look at what we're doing, with government agencies, I do see scenarios where, across Canada, I see cyber vaulting or of critical rebuild being recommended by RCMP, the OPP, provincial agencies. Air gapping of backup data to avoid, heavy cyber attack is something we're seeing. But back to the point of, not everybody's created equal. I think awareness is being driven, but I feel like organizations really need mandates, and it's more recommendations, especially around emerging technology or emerging threat landscapes like this one, the cyber threat. It just moves so fast, it's really hard to keep up with, and it's hard to find, access to where we need to go. So dialogue with executives about the risk, and then mandates at the technical level counter those risks. And it really comes down, and I think, all the panelists said the same thing, in the sense that we need to come together and work more closely in order to be able to help protect each other. So that would be my perspective.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Matt. So switching now to some of the audience Q&A that's come in, there's a question that's come in from Mark, and it's a question about do we, and I assume he means Canada, have a central place to report threats? He was wondering if there's a way, based on his past experience, for an automated way to report things that have come up to a national sort of central body. So I don't know if maybe Dominic or Ray, if you'd want to speak to that question.
Well, very quickly, there is the RCMP have set up a new national center referred to as NC3. Unfortunately, I don't have the information with me, but I can certainly share it, and we can share it out with everyone listening in terms of an address and guidelines on how they do that. I appreciate that. What I was trying to get at a little bit earlier is it can be confusing in terms of where do we report this into? Typically, if it's a criminal matter, the police of jurisdiction are going to take matters into their own hands in terms of following up on it. And so you might have to report to whoever the police of jurisdiction is, and that's not necessarily the RCMP. Nevertheless, the RCMP does have a national center that is trying to pull together and get a sense of where are these threats actually materializing. The CSE's Canadian Cyber Center equally are doing the same thing. I would argue, though, that a lot of companies out there, frankly, are probably very gun shy of wanting to report because you have reputational risks that are associated with reporting potential vulnerabilities that have taken place. So, unless we, and I don't know if this is where Matthew was going, but unless we actually can compel people to at least report how many times were you affected by a cyber attack, a ransomware attack, it's hard to really get a grip on how pervasive these problems are. We know that they're pervasive. We just don't know to what extent. And we're trying to increase awareness, but there needs to be, I think, a way of compelling people to report, make it mandatory reporting, at least in certain sectors, like I talked about before, maybe the financial sector, maybe critical infrastructure sector, in order to get over this reluctance of reporting for fear that somehow your reputation as a company is going to be affected. And I'm not even going into the field of litigation, because there's a whole question around if there was a vulnerability and data was compromised with my company and someone wants to sue us, well, how does that factor in? You've also got people that are starting to buy insurance against ransomware attacks and things of that nature. So the whole litigation aspect, lawyers come into play, and they don't want you to they don't want you to reveal this. So I kind of went on a tangent there from the question. The easy answer to the question is something does exist, but we need to do a better job of explaining what the one-stop shop place is in government to be able to address these things to the extent that we can have a one-stop shop. But more broadly, I think we have a more challenging question on our hands in terms of how people report and why they don't report.
Okay, thanks for that. So there's a question that was submitted here, and I'm going to guess it's from a local or provincial chamber of ours, saying they have a lot of SME members and they want some practical advice for how SMEs can actually understand all of this. So maybe to Tim, and then I'll maybe go over to Matthew after that. We talked about a lot of stuff, and I think the hardest part for a lot of folks is just making that first step. And so do you have any practical advice for, if I'm an SME on Main Street and I want to just get my head around this and dip my toes into the water? I mean, what would you sort of say is that first plunge I need to make? So maybe Tim, go to you first.
Sure. So, there's lots of resources available in the industry to help IT subject matter experts become, more depth with cybersecurity, right? And so there's all sorts of certifications. To make it more practical, though, you could focus on a certification or training specifically on, for instance, cloud computing and how to secure a cloud environment if you want to make it very practical, right? And so AWS offers all sorts of free and pay for education, training, and certification. But certainly the industry as a whole, if you looked at the Cloud Security Alliance, which AWS is a member of, they've got tons of resources to get you started down that path and look at different ways to assess your IT environment and different ways to migrate to different cloud services and so on. So I think, between that and some of the more traditional certifications like the CISSP that it seems to be the de facto standard for employment as a cybersecurity professional. There's lots of ways to get started in the industry. And you heard earlier, I think one of the panelists talked about NIST and NIST frameworks. That's another great source of information, right, is to look at a NIST framework. And that gives you a way to think about, to really frame this problem of cybersecurity for enterprises, and then start to dig into different parts of the framework. And you'll see that there's just lots and lots of stuff there that you can dig into. But the frameworks can be very helpful for, framing the problem and framing, possible approaches to it.
Great. And Matthew, over to you. What's that first bit of advice you'd have for an SME starting out?
I mean, the training route makes a lot of sense, without a doubt. If people are working inside organizations and they're really trying to get a better understanding of whether they're ready for this type of attack or this type of recovery scenario, we work directly with organizations to come in and assess and help to plan. There are a lot of pieces to it, right? So it's imagine yourself in a spot where it's like, you don't really have access to all of your data, or you're unaware of what data you do have access to. And it's like, now I got to rebuild this environment. So we kind of run through a bunch of the process, and we'll talk a lot about, what we've seen in the field with other issues, other major catastrophic failures in different places. So we got a lot of resources to be able to help customers sort of get up and ready. But there is a lot of training material on this as well inside of the Dell homepage. So we could certainly get people hooked up. That answers the question.
Okay, no, thanks. That's great to have, and I think there's a couple of different resources that we've committed to sort of circulating to participants afterwards, and so we'll definitely get those from the speakers and include that in the follow-up email to all participants. So Ray, I want to sort of bring you in on one of the questions here, and again, drawing on some of your corporate memory. There's a question here around sort of the government's long-term sort of national security strategies and how is that approached, and how geoeconomics has featured in that. So maybe we'll start with you, and then I'd like to bring Dominic in from the sort of current practitioner perspective.
Yeah, sorry, in terms of how the whole geoeconomic factors into the national security planning, is that the question? Yeah, and a good question. I mean, it's an important driver in that environment because, as I said from my opening remarks, the world has changed in many ways. In some ways, it has not. And one thing that has not is geopolitical interests and geostrategic interests, which now would translate better into a geoeconomic one. And as a result, it has, I think, from the things I've read as an outsider now from the national security side, created a shift in the thinking of our national security executives. It's also created a shift at the boardroom level. I think most organizations, especially from medium size and larger, certainly recognize they can do business anywhere. And whether it's through some of the platforms like Shopify or other ways, they can sell their wares and create opportunity for business to business and business to consumer. And so now we all have to think about these geostrategic entanglements or these flashpoints. One country's sudden anxiety or anger against Canada can cause a lot of friction in that economic relationship. So that's one sort of simple example. It could also bring on a lot of cyber activity, as I've responded a few times to questions or concerns of clients around, well, I've had this company from this country approach me to buy our intellectual property or buy our firm. We told them not. And then within the 6 months, they suffer a very egregious cyber attack. So it's one of those things, they can't get it through the front door and they'll get it through the back. And I think this underlines the fact Canadians need to stop thinking that the world operates the way we do, because quite often in many jurisdictions, it may not be the case. But of course, there are operators like that everywhere, even though, of course, in Canada. The big thing is, and this maybe just bridges back to the previous question, I think it's such an important one for everybody because it's the baseline for everything. I've told many clients, I've told many business colleagues and others around many tables over the last decade is you will be judged on two things when it comes to cybersecurity. It'll be your preparedness and your response. And on your preparedness is where have you invested, what have you invested in, who have you brought in terms of external advice, in terms of what kind of methodologies. And of course, the response will be, well, who did you call first? So for example, in our X-Force practice, it's designed to respond to clients, and anybody can call that number a client or not, we also have a subset around crisis communications, because I think, Mark, you mentioned it as one of those things, one of us did, is at what point do you disclose? And to whom do you disclose? I think it was Dominic too. Do you go to police of jurisdiction? Do you go to the RCMP? There's also shareholders, stakeholders, regulatory issues. There's a bunch of things. And one needs to think about that a lot in advance. And hence a bit of the preparation that bleeds into the response. And that's why it's best to do this in advance, best to practice it. That's why we invite people to our cyber range all the time. It's free. And we want people to practice their plans and also to think about these things in a garage setting. So to me, that's where we are. So all this is helping us, and the geostrategic, geoeconomic things are going on, are helping us to focus our minds.
Okay. No, thanks for that. So Dominic, I guess just to bring you in on this question, you had alluded earlier in the conversation about a framework that was under development, and you, I think, said it was, I wrote down 16 departments at the table. I mean, working with 16 people is hard enough, let alone 16 departments with lots of people in those departments. And so could you maybe just say a little bit about what that end product may look like in terms of a strategy? And are there any touch points for sort of outside stakeholders and, from our perspective, industry, of course, to be able to, work with government in that framework?
If you've ever worked in government, you mentioned 16 departments. You didn't mention 16 ministers, which is another challenge all unto itself as well. I guess, I mean, in short, we're still developing our advice. So it's hard for me to comment on the advice because we haven't gone to our political masters yet. And it's still very much in the thinking phase, but I'm hoping that we're on the cusp of getting some approval so that we can start rolling it out and start sharing where we're going. And I think, in short, to answer your question, there's going to be a significant amount of stakeholder engagement that's going to need to take place. And frankly, before we finalize anything, we need to engage stakeholders to make sure that we're coming up with solutions that make sense, practically speaking. If I could just build on what Ray was describing, because not surprisingly, he was pretty bang on in terms of describing the lay of the land and the environment. I will say that, not surprisingly, with the advent of ever developing technology, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, dare I say 5G networks, which is a bit of a radioactive conversation in the national security realm here in Canada for a variety of reasons that are very germane to our conversation today. But all this to say that the threat now, it permeates every aspect of society. And the challenge for government is you can't possibly protect every aspect of society. So from my standpoint, I think where we're trying to go is you need to at least come up with what are the crown jewels for the government of Canada? What are the things that are of utmost importance when it comes to national security? And when you start asking yourself that question, recently the government of Canada, for example, released a list of critical minerals following in the steps of what the Americans did. I think we have to come up with what are the emerging technologies? What is the intellectual property that we care about the most? And those are the things that we really need to sort of protect first and foremost. In preparing for this panel discussion, Mark, you had asked a question about semiconductors in supply chains. You're hitting the nail right on the head. There are certain commodities that are of utmost importance to today's society. And those are the things that we have, as a government, I think, we need to focus on first and foremost. The last thing I'll add is, and I think, and again, this is building on a point that Ray raised a little bit earlier, but we're not in this alone. Obviously, as Ray had pointed out in his opening remarks, there are no longer boundaries when it comes to the threat and cybersecurity. And because of that, every country, particularly Western countries, all of our allies, are facing the exact same problems. So there really is a need for us to be able to cooperate, collaborate, set international standards, and make sure that we're actually sharing lessons learned and working hand in hand to sort of identify and defend against the significant threats that are coming about.
No, that's great. Thanks for that. And I think I can speak on behalf of all of our members to say that we will certainly welcome the opportunity to engage when you're at the stage that you can reach out to stakeholders about that plan. So conscious of time, with 5 minutes left, I'm going to put one last question to Ray, Matt, and Tim to answer, and that's around I guess the pace of technological change. And there was a question here submitted around how COVID has changed the security environment. So could you maybe just each give me sort of 2 minutes on how COVID specifically is changing the pace of innovation and security risks that are out there. So maybe, we'll do Tim, and then we'll go to Matt, and then we'll go to Ray for the last word. So Tim, we can start with you.
Sure. And I mean, it goes without saying that the COVID crisis is tragic, right? The loss of death in Canada and other places is just tragic. In terms of how, it has impacted IT and what we're seeing in the cloud is, prior to the crisis, many of the organizations that I would advise would take weeks or months to go through their security assessment process to assess new technology, to make sure that it met their internal security standards and their regulated or industry standards. And when the COVID crisis hit and the workforce shifted primarily to remote work, that was a game changer. So most of the digital transformation initiatives that enterprises were trying to get off the ground or were in process dramatically accelerated because of the shift in the workforce. And so instead of taking weeks or months to do security assessments, that literally happened overnight. Some organizations either compressed their assessments or did some of the assessment prior to adopting, and then after adoption, they went back and finished their due diligence process. So it definitely accelerated adoption of new technology to address the shifting workforce. I don't think that means that necessarily that they took a shortcut, because they didn't. I think that with new technology like the cloud, I think they just recognized that, I liken it to, the first person that drove a fully electric car up to an emissions testing point, right? They had to do it because the law said you have to get your car, emissions tested. It couldn't pass the test because there was no place to hook the equipment up to. And so they were at a standstill. How do we certify this car for emissions? When the reality is the car meets emissions in a way that normal cars could never meet. And so that's what I really saw, and the learning process that a lot of the enterprises that I talked to went through.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Matthew, over to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, without a doubt, we have seen a lot of pressure on organizations try to scale through the COVID crisis. And certainly as they've tried to move their employees to a virtual workspace, it's put a lot of new pressures across organizations. I mean, what I've seen in my business is through COVID, there have been a lot of attacks. And I would say that organizations they haven't necessarily been ready. I mean, there are many calls that we get on a regular basis where companies are really struggling with whether or not they should pay ransomware, whether they are going to be able to recover in time, whether they should report. There's all sorts of downstream impacts or dependencies on all these decisions. I mean, often in a ransom situation, the ransom might only be $20,000 or $50,000. It doesn't look like it's all that much money. But the true cost of ransom is probably closer to $10 million with exposed, downstream pieces, right? So being able to, figure out how you figure out what data got exposed and who, is in the chain downstream. So I guess what I've seen is it's put a lot more pressure on data protection. It's put a lot more pressure on the recovery side of the NIST framework. And definitely it's elevating cyber to the top of the chain.
Sure. No, thanks for that. So Ray, last word over to you.
Yeah, I'll keep it down to about 30 seconds or so, because a lot of smart things were just said, and I couldn't disagree with any of those. Just moving forward, it's really the lessons learned that really stand out in my mind have been agility and interoperability. And the agility being this idea that you cannot depend on the environment that you had previously built. That may be the office space, to the networks and the perimeters that you thought were well secured. And that you have to think about this in a way that cloud is important. But when I think about interoperability, then I think of the importance of hybrid multi-cloud and the idea of not being locked in and having an ability to be able to shift your workloads and be able to do a lot of things, especially in an open source architectural construct. And then lastly is that we are about to see a decade of unprecedented innovation. That's my view. And it'll be everything stemming from mRNA related advances on vaccines to the fact that we will accelerate to AI. This will be the time of cognitive. And from that, though, last thought is it's going to bring incredible innovation, but it'll be things in a dual stream. There'll be opportunities and great things, and there'll be equal measures of threats. And we have to never be too hopeful and not be too distracted, and always be mindful of the fact that others are trying to undermine progress.
Well, I think that sort of note of both realism with a bit of optimism is actually a perfect note to end the conversation on. And I think it pretty aptly sums up a lot of the discussion that we've had, today. And as we said to folks, we'll circulate some of the information from the panelists that was mentioned on the call in the thank you email afterwards. But I do want to say thank you again to our panelists for making the time. This was a great discussion. It goes without saying that we could have kept going for easily another hour. It feels like 60 minutes goes by too fast. But I do want to be respectful of everyone's time and just say thank you to the audience for joining us for the last hour. And we hope they see you at the next iteration of the Chamber's 4th Industrial Revolution webinar series. Enjoy the rest of your day.